Welcome to today's webinar on managing absenteeism in education. My name is Catherine Sinclair and I'm a Senior Associate in Anthony Collins' Employment and Pensions team. So before we begin, I thought it would be good if we did an overview of what I'm going to look at today. So I'm going to mention some preliminary issues that we need to think about when managing absenteeism. I'm going to talk about creating that optimal culture. I'm going to remind us about the differences between short-term absence and long-term absence and the relevant steps to take. When absence becomes a problem, we're going to look at some of the decisions that you need to make. We'll then talk about occupational health and how they can be really useful, but most importantly, how to get the best out of your referrals. We've all been there when we've received a not particularly helpful report. And finally, we're going to conclude with looking at some tricky situations. What do you do when? And I'm going to talk you through some case studies. So without further ado, we're going to proceed. So, preliminary issues, policies and procedures. Perhaps not your favourite documents in the world, but as an employment lawyer, I can tell you they are really useful. So the question is, are they in place? Are they accessible? And are both employees and as an employer, are you aware of what's in them? A question for you, if you're a multi-academy trust and you've got an employee who's absent that's perhaps tupied in from a local authority or another academy, they might be on a different policy or procedure if you haven't got trust-wide policies in place. So it's really important that you've got the right policy matched up with the correct employee. A little word on record keeping. I can't emphasise enough how important it is to keep this up to date, and accuracy is crucial. Often with these situations, particularly if you're managing a long-term absence, you duck in and out of the situation. You may not have all the facts in memory. In the event of dispute, it's really helpful, and it's helped both parties be reminded of where you are in the process. If you're in the state sector, then you need to be familiar with Burgundy Book provisions, which set out minimum level of teacher sick pay entitlements on a sliding scale. Again, for teaching support staff, for support staff, the Green Book applies. If you're an independent school or an academy or free school, then you might have established your own sick pay schemes, and so be familiar with those too. So moving on, creating the culture. So the aim is actually to keep your staff at work. And if they're not at work, if they're absent, then you want to give them the best support to return to work. Because in these challenging times with funding cuts and staff having to do more and more work, we want to know how we can support them best and how we can deliver our primary objective as schools, which is providing first-class education. So I'm suggesting a two-pronged approach. The first, how can we be understanding and accessible, but at the same time, put in place effective monitoring and management. And both of these things are really important. We need to strike a balance and a partnership. So I'd encourage you not to shy away from having those difficult conversations, but clearly right at the beginning, being approachable and supportive is key. So line managers will usually be the first point of contact for employees calling in sick. In some schools and maths, that may be the human resources team or the business manager may have this role. But whoever is the point of contact for employees off sick should receive appropriate training in taking responsibility for their role in the employer's reporting procedure. We need to think about training our staff so that they deal sympathetically with staff and they question appropriately so that they have sufficient information to recognise any issues which might require further inquiries or follow-up action. Now, in most situations, it will be appropriate to ask the employee the reason for their absence and the likely date of return. And this information will help us as employers to determine the likely impact of the absence. So, for example, do we need to get in temporary cover, as well as to assess whether or not you might need to gather further information or put in place supportive measures to get that employee back to work. So, for example, an absence which an employee puts down to a cold or flu will be likely to last only a few days and may be an isolated occurrence. But if a particular employee is frequently on work due to colds, there may be some underlying cause which has not yet been identified. And after a number of occurrences, it may be appropriate to question the employee regarding the medical treatment that perhaps they're receiving, or if there is anything else going on. Equally, you might need to consider whether an absence might have been triggered by an incident at work, which the employee is reluctant to take any further, but which may require further investigation, perhaps under a grievance or whistleblowing policy, particularly if an employee eventually comes out with the fact they're being bullied or harassed by another member of staff. The aim of the game, though, is to get our employees who are absent back to work where possible. So revisiting some basics. When an employee is off sick, it's important to keep in contact and updated on any medical condition, the reason for their absence, and keep a paper trail. So being understandable and accessible is key to remaining in contact. A quick mention on medical evidence, particularly where you suspect the absence may not be genuine. You're going to have to investigate. So there is a culture, there needs to be a culture and awareness that's set out in your policies that all absences will require self-certification for the first 7 days and then a statement of fitness after that. But it's important to note that you can go behind the medical evidence that might be presented to you. And there was an interesting 1981 case called Hutchinson versus Enfield Rolling Mills. And in that case, the Employment Appeal Tribunal refuted a tribunal decision that dismissal of 2 employees who were seen at a demonstration when off sick was unfair. And the Employment Appeal Tribunal noted that the doctor's note was not necessarily conclusive. So if you are presented with a reason for an absence, you don't always have to take that at face value. Because clearly, if an employee is taken sick leave when they're not genuinely unfit, it could be more of a conduct issue. And it's important to check that your disciplinary policies have included this, and perhaps in looking at your sickness policy to look whether or not there's a clause to the effect that the school will take reasonable steps to investigate sickness, etc., or something along those lines. And then the investigation would be as per a normal conduct issue, mindful of the ACAS Code of Conduct regards investigation. It must be reasonable in circumstances, and the more serious the allegation, the more thorough the level of investigation. General research can also be included, so social media, word of mouth, that's permitted as part of the investigation, provided it meets the test of reasonableness. So when absence becomes a problem, short-term absence. Where an employee has a series of short-term absences, it can be easy for us as employers to overlook the fact that there may be a pattern emerging. And so perhaps you might be slow to realise that the matter needs to be dealt with formally. And it comes back to the two-pronged approach, and here the second approach of that, creating that culture. Do we have effective monitoring and management in place? It's also important here to work out whether or not there's an underlying health condition giving rise to the absences, and to satisfy yourselves that the absences are indeed genuine. This is to combat any potential disability discrimination claims that could arise, or to check that this shouldn't be dealt with under the conduct or disciplinary proceedings. The employee's absence may not even be health related. It may relate to a problem with colleague or manager or workload, which, let's face it, in school context can often be a problem. In respect of long-term absence, employers are often wary of dealing with individuals who've been off sick for a prolonged period, especially where the cause of their sickness is not clear or they're awaiting diagnosis. But I'd encourage you not to allow the situation to drift until it reaches the point where the employee has been off for so long that the dismissal starts to look like the only viable option. But clearly that can lead to problems under unfair dismissal and disability discrimination law. So proactiveness is key. So revisiting short-term absence, there may be irregular and normal amount versus a pattern of absences. So that is usually covered under short-term absence policy. And clearly at a first formal meeting and subsequent meetings, you need to look at what is the reason for the absence. It's really good practice to talk about the effect that the absence of the individual has on the rest of the school and the organisation. You want to look at the likelihood of continuing and recurring absences, and in that case, particularly if you are suspicious of an underlying condition, it might be appropriate to refer the employee to occupational health and obtain a medical report to see if there's any other underlying disability, because that will trigger your duty to make potential reasonable adjustments. Now, when managing short-term absence, you may not always have to do that, but you must plan that into your process and have that in mind and follow your procedures. So for short-term absence, it might be worth looking at what measures you could put in place to improve attendance. And clearly, if you're managing on a short-term basis and there is no underlying condition, you might consider giving a target or a warning or something called an absence improvement notice to improve the employee's attendance. If there is an underlying condition, then clearly any absence related to that potentially disability would need to be discounted when issuing an absence improvement notice. But I'd advise you to get specifically advice on your current situation should you find yourself in that situation. The other thing to think about is changes or redeployment opportunities that would assist and potentially reduce the effect on colleagues or principals. So always follow your process, that's your usual processes in your policy, and look at whether or not there's a pattern. Back to work interviews here are key, because sometimes that can put people off taking short-term absence or pulling a sickie or taking the odd day here and then if they know that they're going to not exactly face the Spanish Inquisition, but be questioned about their absence. And let's face it, if you have pulled a sickie, you're more likely to be less confident about that, and that can be a deterrent to taking ad hoc absences for no good reason. Return to work interviews are also really key about addressing any underlying issues. So is there any stress or bullying, and whether they're factors, because if they are, as an employer, you've got the responsibility to deal with that, and dealing with that head on could assist long term with getting that employee back to work or investigating any potential grievance the employee has. So trigger any disciplinary or capability processes with care and after sufficient research and evidence. And again, accurate records, keep them, they're key. Long-term absence. It's really important here to address what the real nature of the problem is. So if someone's off long-term sick, is there a physical or mental illness? Is there another reason for the absence? So for example, have you just started disciplinary proceedings, or perhaps you're mid-disciplinary proceedings, or perhaps the employee is facing a performance review? And clearly fitness to attend work is a very different question to fitness to attend a meeting, and that's something you might need to consider if the absence persists. Normally you would wait for the employee to return to work before continuing with disciplinary proceedings, but certainly if the employee has perhaps raised a grievance or has other concerns that need resolving, it might be in the employee's best interest to resolve those and to assist that employee back to work. Maintain communication for as long and as much as possible and appropriate. So similar patterns, so looking at, you instigate that first meeting. Many policies in school context have an initial formal meeting before invoking an official capability management proceedings. But the concepts for the information that you need to obtain and when you obtain them are consistent throughout. So you are always looking at when the likely date of return might be, what is the reason for the absence, and in the long-term situation you are going to need to obtain a medical report to get a view on whether or not there is an underlying disability. And also you have a duty to make reasonable adjustments if so. And so the question to ask would be whether the employee perceives they can return to their previous job without adjustments, or whether they perceive they can return to their previous job provided that certain adjustments are made. And then there are questions to ask, well, as a school, can we accommodate, can we make those adjustments? And if the employee is disabled, you have a positive duty to make any adjustments that are reasonable. There will be the opportunity to explore alternatives, and the employee may raise those, or you as the employer may wish to raise the option of redeployment, which may be an option or may not be. So when absence remains a problem, once you've obtained your medical report, it's really important to meet and discuss the report with the employee and consult with the employee before taking any action on the basis of its recommendations. So that actually involves consultation, and that involves an ongoing two-way exchange of information and views concerning the employee's illness between the parties, and full evaluation of any available medical evidence. This is especially important where there is any conflict between the evidence put forward by the employee and that obtained by the employer, which, let's face it, is often the case. The other thing you want to consult about is the types of reasonable adjustments. So it's not just on the employee's duty to put forward any reasonable adjustments they might want. You have a duty as employer to implement anything recommended in the occupational health report if possible. Sometimes on the matter of redeployment, any discussion should be approached sensitively, because an employee might see it as a criticism of their abilities or a demotion. But if the job is in another school, for example, the employer will need to consider any relocation arrangements, and that would have to be agreed by the employee. And reasonable adjustments might also need to be made to the procedure. So, for example, meetings could take place at the employee's home or other convenient location. The employee might require more notice of meetings than provided for in your policy, or more time to read material and prepare for meetings. Another potential reasonable adjustment could be adjusting the trigger point for issuing an absence improvement notice if you're going down the short-term absence management route. But provided you're reasonably flexible, you won't be expected to hold off from taking decisions indefinitely. So in the context of long-term absence, and it looks like the employee is not going to be able to return to work, or the prognosis is such that it cannot be said when, if at all, the employee might be fit, then you'll need to consider the situation carefully. There may be options to explore other than the obvious route of dismissal on capability grounds, and it's important to consider these options, both from the point of view of unfair dismissal law, and also because there may be contractual entitlements which arise, and failure to explore them may give rise to claims for breach of contract. Now, I'd like to make a note really about, make a point about early retirement. So early retirement by reason of ill health may be an option for employees who are unable to continue working. Now, both the Teachers' Pension Scheme and the Local Government Pension Scheme offer this and allow members to retire and claim their pension before their normal retirement age if they are suffering from ill health or incapacity. And it's worth considering whether this is an option before dismissal, and the employee would need to go to an independent medical health expert for an opinion, but they need to be permanently unable to do their own job until normal pensionable age, and that they're not immediately capable of undertaking gainful employment either. So that the bar is quite high, and gainful employment usually refers to not being able to do anything less than 30 hours a week for a period of not less than 12 months. So it's important to consider this. It's not rocket science, but when you've reached the point where dismissal for ill health is contemplated, you'll usually have held at least 2 previous meetings with the employee, and you should satisfy yourselves that the reason for dismissal is ill health and that you have adopted a fair procedure. So at this point, you would write to the employee, and this letter should not come as a surprise. You should have received sufficient correspondence with you and sufficient dealings with you to try and find a solution, so that the letter should not be a shock. And ideally, you'd outline the details of the absence, the impact on school of the absence, enclose relevant medical reports, and inform them that you're considering dismissal, and that could be one possible outcome of the capability hearing. And clearly, then you would need to invite them to the hearing, give them the right to be accompanied, and it's an opportunity to meet with them and for them to state their case, provide any other evidence and mitigating circumstances that you might not be aware of. We often have the situation where employees don't attend, and it's reasonable to rearrange the hearing at least once, but also really good practice to invite the employee to submit written representations on their behalf and to warn them that you may make a decision in their absence and on all the evidence available. But that reasonable response to that hearing is something that you could potentially consider if required. So can you dismiss an employee prior to the end of their control sick pay period? Well, you can, but beware you'd be exposing the school to being at risk of a valid claim for breach of contract or wrongful dismissal. And the other thing to think about is that if you're dismissing for long-term sickness as the reason for the dismissal, that does fall under the category of capability, which is listed as a potentially fair reason for the dismissal. The fact that the employee's entitlement to contractual sick pay has not been exhausted could also be relevant, though, to the fairness of the procedure in an unfair dismissal claim when deciding whether or not the school acted reasonably in taking the decision to dismiss. So beware of that. We've talked about unfair dismissal, wrong fair dismissal, breach of contract claims. The other thing is that you could be at risk of a disability discrimination claim if the employee is disabled. That doesn't mean to say that you cannot dismiss. You need to be fair and have gone through the process so that the decision to dismiss is fair and reasonable in the circumstances. Types of discrimination claims that can arise are direct discrimination, i.e. I was treated less favourably than someone that doesn't have my disability, so less favourable treatment. But for the disability, there would be no dismissal. It's not usually a defence and sickness dismissals. You often have unfavourable treatment arising as a consequence of something to do with my disability. So I was dismissed for my absence, and my absence was related to my disability. So you need to show that you have made reasonable adjustments, you've considered alternative options before taking the decision to dismiss, and you'd need to show that your action to dismiss was proportionate in the circumstances and went no further than was necessary. So moving on to occupational health and how to get the best out of your referrals. You need to establish the reason for the absence so that you can rule out or deal with any work-related cause or trigger, and we want to be alert for any signs of workplace stress. So the best way to do that is obtain medical evidence if the employee doesn't talk to us directly. So depending on the illness in question, you might want to consider requesting that the employee attends an examination with an independent specialist doctor or occupational health expert. It's normal for us to bear the cost of the examination if it's been undertaken at your request. I say us, I mean you as the employers. And then information from an independent specialist who has not been previously responsible for the employee is often seen as more reliable than information from the employee's GP. And once you're in possession of a medical report about an employee, you'd be well advised to act in accordance with any recommendations, unless there is a good evidence-based reason not to do so. So it's really important that you get the information back that you need, and that will all depend on the questions that you ask. So occupational health, why involve them? Well, for three reasons really. One, to help resolve the situation by finding out what further steps can be taken to get an employee back to work, and to find out whether an employee has a disability and so is protected by the Equality Act, and to find out the employee's functional ability and not their medical history. So their ability to do the job. That is your primary objective. We'll be familiar, hopefully, with the process. So you make a referral, step one. Step two, the occupational health will invite the employee to consultation. Step three, a consultation will occur between occupational health and the employee. And then step four, you receive the occupational health report and review how to respond to move the situation forward in conjunction with the employee. So, first point, it's really important to be precise and clear in your referral. The amount of times I have seen referrals that have not been precise and clear enough. So you want to help the occupational health advisor as much as possible, and that means giving details about the role they do and the context and what that entails. So whether you've got a teacher, a teaching assistant, a business manager, or even a chief executive or a cook, it's all important. You need to be clear about why you are referring the employee. So perhaps, are you aware of a health problem and so need to know which aspects of the job the employee can and can't do? Perhaps you're unsure about why the employee is absent and you need to understand whether they are able to return to work at all and when. And broadly speaking, there are two types of questions. The first questions seek to establish whether the employee is disabled for the purposes of the Equality Act. But you should be aware that the question of whether or not someone has a disability is actually ultimately a question for the Employment Tribunal, and the opinion of the medical expert is not necessarily determinative, but it will be taken into consideration. The second type of questions that need to be considered by you before deciding whether to take are questions which you need to consider the answers to before deciding whether to take steps to redeploy or dismiss an employee who has been absent through illness for a long period, or perhaps to make an application for ill health early retirement. So often, not enough detail comes back in an occupational health report, and it's very frustrating, and further questions need to be asked, incurring sometimes further costs. Sometimes further questions need to be asked anyway, but it's good if you can send out a good instruction letter in the first place, or come to us and take advice on your instruction letter. So, what type of referral questions would you be making? So, you want to find out if there's an underlying medical condition affecting the employee's performance or attendance at work. You'll also want to find out whether or not the condition is covered by the Equality Act, and sometimes that means breaking down the definition of that. And again, if you're not sure about how to do that, come and speak to us. Are there any measures? You might want them to outline any measures which have been or have been taken to treat or correct the employee's impairment, and measures might include medical treatment of any kind or the use of other aids. And you might want to find out if these measures are going to need to be continued. And you'd also perhaps like to ask some questions about whether or not the effect of stopping those measures, what that effect would be on the employee, and whether any improvement in their condition may be temporary or permanent with those measures or without. Reasonable adjustments. I've mentioned that several times during this webinar, and I'll mention it again because they're really key. So if you've already made any reasonable adjustments at the point of making the referral to occupational health, then it's a good idea to list them and then ask them to confirm whether or not there are any further adjustments which occupational health might consider necessary, and in what way they would assist the employee to perform their duties. So also it's good practice to ask not just about further adjustments, to ask whether there are any short-term adjustments perhaps that could be made to the work tasks or environment that might help facilitate rehabilitation, and also ask any permanent adjustments to the employee's work tasks or environment if they're recommended. Returns to work. At the end of the day, we want to know if occupational health consider it probable that the employee will return to work within any particular period of time, because that will inform whether or not we should keep the job open, whether or not we should look to facilitate a return to work, or whether or not we're looking at a situation where a return is not likely, we might move towards a dismissal. It's good practice to enclose a copy of the job description and to ask whether the employee is currently able to carry out the duties outlined in the job description, and that will help the occupational health get to the grips of what it is the employee does day to day, short of asking the employee. If you haven't managed to get this from the employee, and depending on the circumstances of the absence, you might like to consider asking whether or not the absence might be caused or exacerbated by work, because if so, there might be something within your power that you can do, an action that you can take. One of the questions you want to know is whether or not the ill health problem is likely to recur or affect future attendance, particularly if you're making a referral in a short-term absence scenario where there's frequent absence. And if someone has been off for a very long time and you're making a subsequent referral to occupational health, you might like to consider enclosing your company pension scheme rules and guidance for medical practitioners to obtain an opinion on whether, according to the criteria in the rules, whether the employee is a suitable candidate for ill health retirement under the scheme. Often we can have some unhelpful questions that you ask that we see in occupational health reports. So I'd suggest you might avoid asking the following. Please review. Why? Well, it's too vague. It is not going to elicit perhaps the information that you might like, unless you've got a very competent occupational health advisor who is used to writing reports and takes the initiative and writes something that's helpful. 2, is the employee likely to be in regular attendance in the future? This is really impossible to predict and is not going to elicit a particularly helpful answer. For a start, it's a closed question and you might just get a yes or no answer, but more often than not, it's impossible to predict. What would be a better question is, what level of absence would it be reasonable for a person with this condition to have in a year? Because questions like that would help you ascertain, particularly if a person's got a disability, whether or not you need to adjust the trigger point for triggering an absence improvement notice, for example, in a short-term absence management scenario, or to look at whether or not the person's absence is actually more excessive than would be required normally for a person with that condition. What do you think is the diagnosis and prognosis? So in a complex case that's still undergoing investigations, occupational health simply would not be able to answer because it's likely that where they're under hospital care, that is being done elsewhere. So it's better to focus on the duties and ability to do the job. And I'm going to revisit timings of occupational health in a minute. So some final tips on how to get the best out of your occupational health referrals. Well, number 1, you've got to win the employee's trust. The more collaborative the process, the better the outcome will be for both of you. Think about the timing of a referral. So if it's mid-diagnosis or immediately post-surgery, a referral to occupational health is not going to be recommended. You don't always have to agree with the occupational health report, but you'll need strong reasons for ignoring medical advice, and it comes back to that case that I mentioned earlier. And certainly I have been asked to advise in the past where an employer has no knowledge whatsoever of an employee suffering a particular disability, and to all intents and purposes, when presenting, they've been able to do all of their jobs without any problem. We have a short spell of absence, it goes to occupational health, and we have an opinion that they may potentially be disabled under the Act. And the report conflicts with all evidence that has been presented to the employer. So that is a difficult situation. And moving on to tricky situations, what do you do when? So looking at the first one, a teacher has been absent for a month and attempts to communicate with her are ignored, and you are unaware of what might be the problem. Well, there could be a number of problems here, and the importance of this is to not ignore the problem and until it becomes an even bigger problem. So on a micro level, we can see here that the teacher's not complying with policy. We can assume that he or she is not ringing in, they've not phoned in, they've not submitted any doctor's notes, they've essentially absent without authorization. On a kind of macro point, if the teacher has been absent for a month and you've not noticed, then clearly that says something about the school's monitoring processes, but I suspect you would be aware. The question is, what action would you take? And if someone is absent without authorization, then you could just jump straight to a disciplinary policy and follow your procedure. However, a reasonable approach might be sending a preliminary letter saying you're worried about the teacher's absence and inviting them to come to a meeting because you've had no content tucked for them. And if they don't contact you by a certain date, then you will have you'll start disciplinary action and then invite them to a full meeting. So at least gives them the chance to respond. You might want to telephone them to try and make contact, and presumably HR will have an address. So as far as a duty of care, it might be worth, if there's a colleague that is a friend, that looking to see if they are there and alive and well. And so the reason why we brought this as a potential case study is getting us to look at things might not always be what they seem. And we have a duty of care to employees, and it's about getting that balance between being approachable and supportive and giving pastoral care, and actually carrying out effective monitoring and management processes for our employees who are absent, so that we don't stick our hand in the sands until it's too late and we suddenly want to dismiss someone. And needless to say, being absent without authorisation is not a case for gross misconduct. So you're going to need to go through the warning procedure before you can ultimately dismiss someone. And often that can be slightly tricky when you haven't done anything about it. The teacher's gone AWOL and you've got pressure on the school and you want to put in a new teacher in place. But you've got notice requirements to comply with, and I have also received telephone calls going, yes, we want to issue a dismissal letter tomorrow. well, you can, but you're going to be exposing the school to a potential unfair dismissal claim. That's not advisable. It's really important to proactively manage absence when it first arises. The second situation, what do you do when a member of the maintenance team, perhaps your caretaker or other member, alleges that they cannot work because of a bad back but has been spotted working at a local garden centre at the weekends? Again, things may not be all that they seem. So here we've got, we know that they're off sick, they're not at school, they've told you they've got a bad back. This is clearly an opportunity to refer them to occupational health. You'd need to send a job description, and you'd want to be knowing, can they carry out the duties within the job description currently? What can they, can't they do? Are they covered by the Equality Act? Because if there's a recurring back condition that's lasts 12 months or more, or has the potential to last 12 months or more, and it has a substantial adverse effect on a person's ability to carry out day-to-day activities, then they're likely to be disabled and protected under the Equality Act. So if you find that at the occupational health interview that he presents as, oh, I cannot possibly do anything, I cannot get out of bed, I cannot move, I cannot do anything, and then you've got this other intelligence that he's been working at a local garden centre at the weekends, well, then there's a suggestion perhaps that he's being dishonest. So again, we shouldn't jump to conclusions here, because you'd want to check the evidence of what they're actually doing at the garden centre. For example, it may be that he's not doing any heavy lifting or any maintenance, he has an entirely different job. So you'd want to talk to the employee first about what they were doing at the garden centre, and you might want to include some suitably worded questions within the referral to occupational health. If you have enough evidence that the person is being dishonest, then clearly that's enough to start disciplinary proceedings. But we shouldn't jump to that conclusion, and particularly if the person has a recurring back condition, then we have that duty to make reasonable adjustments, and we need to look at getting that employee back to work, because it could be that the occupational health report comes back that they can do a lot of their jobs, but they can't do heavy lifting, or that they could do their job if you provided them with manual lifting aids and they were able to do duties that were working upright. And that is something you might need to consider. And it may be that they're able to do this at the local garden centre at weekends, which is very kind of low impact, and they're able to do that. It's outside working time, and maybe they are just showing clients around the garden centre, for example. So the importance of this is don't jump to conclusions. What do you do when you've got a teaching assistant that's been absent for 7 separate Mondays during the last 6 months? The anecdotal evidence is big weekends, perhaps from other colleagues or from Facebook posts that you might have seen, but self-certification notes say they've got a bad cold. Perhaps you're looking at this case study and going, oh, this is a clear-cut case. Is this as bad as it sounds? But I just want to come back to its importance of creating the right culture and the balance of being approachable and supportive and effective monitoring. And clearly this is a situation where you need to take some kind of action, and if you don't, you could be encouraging the wrong culture within your schools, that it's okay to take a sicky day here and there. And again, I'd like to emphasise the importance of return to work interviews and ensure that you have one every time the teaching assistant is off, because something as little as that can sometimes act as a deterrent. You also need to look at managing this in your short-term absence policy, and potentially issue an absence improvement notice or a warning. So you need to look at your policy for trigger points and issuing when it's appropriate to issue your warning after how many absences. The other importance of a return to work interview is just to check that there are no underlying issues. It's an opportunity for a two-way conversation between an employee and their employer. So check your policies and be consistent with how you approach this. And don't just pick a fight with one employee. Make sure you're consistent with everybody who's doing this. What do you do when a PE teacher has to have physio for their back every Wednesday afternoon? We can assume that their back condition is a disability here under the Equality Act, but they're now taking Thursday mornings off as well. And the reason given is recovering from physio. Again, this is a question really for how well you can work really effectively with occupational health, because it's a question you might want to ask as to what kind of physio they are having. Is it appropriate for the injury? How long should the physio or the treatment last for? Is it something that's for short term? Is it something that is vital that they have to have week in, week out to maintain their back? There might be room to negotiate with the employee the timing of the physio appointments, so there's slightly less impact on school if they're going to be having time off the next day to recover. And what level of, another question to ask occupational health would be, what level of recovery time would be reasonable for a person with a back condition to have after this level of physio? And again, you might want to look at questions about what level of absence it would be reasonable for a person with the back condition to have within a year. You need to look at the level of impact on your other staff and the cost of cover. So it depends on whether you have another PE teacher that can step in, but presumably people will be stretched already and have other commitments. So if the back condition is not improving, then you would be looking to manage through the capability procedure. If the back condition is not getting any better, you might have to look at alternatives and ultimately a dismissal. But again, it's you would need to make a reasonable adjustment for this and accommodate that, but you'd want to get some more information from your occupational health in terms of whether or not it would be reasonable to have that level of time off every morning after physio. And final case study. You have an older teacher who has been at the school for over 20 years recently because they had a hip replacement. She refuses to meet with occupational health and says she will come back when she is good and ready. So again, I can't emphasize enough that it's important to start communication. Presumably you're already in communication, I'd hope so, and to keep this going. And sometimes persuasive techniques is what is required. You don't want to force her back, that needs to be communicated, but you need an idea of what the school can do to assist her back in terms of making reasonable adjustments, both short and long term. Now, you ideally might want an opinion from occupational health, but you can't force her to meet with them if she doesn't consent to it. But from this point, you'd have to advise her that if she refuses to engage with the process, he or she, the case study refers to as she, so you'd need to advise that you would have to make decisions in her absence regarding this. And one other option would be to get permission to write to the claimant's or the teacher's GP to find out realistically how long recovery from a hip replacement might take. And the other thing you might want to persuade the teacher is that occupational health can be a real assistance in the fact that they're not there just to catch the employee out, but to ensure that the teacher is not overloaded with duties on their return to work. So it's all about keeping that dialogue going, but essentially if an employee refuses to engage with the process, this shouldn't disable you from taking any action, provided you are reasonable and in moving through the capability procedure you can take further action. So points to take away from that. Managing absence as well creates a culture where employees feel supported, but they're less likely to play the system. It also mitigates the risk of lengthy and expensive disability discrimination and unfair dismissal claims. So if you're going to take anything away, follow systems, involve occupational health, Think about your questions that you put in your referral, because what you ask dictates what you will get back. Keep communication open, which will help you save on unlimited injury to feelings awards later. Thank you for listening.